So I had an interesting question the other day. Someone was asking what would be the best turbo upgrade for it was a 3-litre TDI engine. But the question actually expands, and I think it would be useful to just discuss the best turbo upgrades. And there's various routes you can go. Some are more complex and require a lot more work. Others are fairly straightforward, almost drop-in replacements for your stock turbo. So in this video, we're just going to discuss turbo upgrades. So you've got a turbo engine, whether it's diesel, petrol, gasoline, whatever you want to call it, and you just want more power from it. The turbocharger is usually the best way of achieving that. So we're going to break apart the subject of turbos. We're going to look at those easy upgrade paths that you can take, and then we're going to look at the more complex routes to go for those higher power figures. So effectively, the turbocharger is a unit that connects to the exhaust manifold or the exhaust headers, whatever you like to call them, and the exhaust flows through them and it generates pressure on the intake side, pushing more air into the engine. So as a unit, turbochargers are fairly standard in terms of the design and the way they actually work. The only real differences are generally the apertures that allow the gases to flow into the turbocharger and out again, and sometimes the positioning of the various ancillary components that you have on the turbocharger, such as the wastegate control mechanism and oil feeds, cooling feeds, various other feeds that go into the modern turbocharger unit. So whenever you add a new turbo to an engine, it does require adjustment. The wastegate controller controls the way the turbo wastegate opens and closes, effectively allowing the exhaust gases to flow through the turbo, and that will need to be fine-tuned. The turbos do not generally come completely preset, so it does require a slight bit of adjustment. Otherwise you start getting overboost or underboost errors or other problems with your turbo. So even if you're just replacing a turbo like for like, you do need to make an adjustment on the wastegate, and in some cases may need to adjust the tune within the computer to allow for the differences in the new turbo. You may need to adjust the tune within the computer to allow for the differences in the old turbo and the new turbo. So if you just want an easy upgrade option, you're really looking for something you can just bolt on and replace and hope for the best. So when you've got a manufacturer that make different power levels, you'll often find they do different size turbochargers. So Audi, for example, they generally have a 140 horsepower and a 190 horsepower and various variations on those. And the lower powered variants tend to have these smaller turbochargers that tend to top out at those relatively lower power figures, but they spool up nicely. You get decent power low down, and the higher powered engines tend to come with larger turbos that don't run out of puff quite so soon. So because the exhaust design is the same between those two engines, the turbocharger unit pretty much just unbolts and bolts on. So it's a fairly simple upgrade just to choose an upgrade from your manufacturer to take you up to the next power level. So there's a lot of aftermarket turbos available as well. So Garrett, one of the biggest turbocharger makers out there, have various different configurations on the intake side and on the exhaust side. So the most notable things is generally the shape and size of the exhaust aperture. You'll notice on a twin scroll turbo you have two exhaust apertures within one, allowing the exhaust gases to flow directly from the cylinders that they've been allocated from into the turbocharger to allow the turbo to spool up most effectively. So there's quite a bit of variation there, but you really do need to choose a design of turbo that is compatible with the mounting points that you've got on the car. So a lot of aftermarket companies have actually come along and they've produced a complete turbo kit which just bolts on to your engine. So rather than just buying the turbo unit, you're buying the mounts for the exhaust headers, the exhaust manifold that connect your new turbo to the engine. And that becomes a much easier route because they've worked out all of the different plumbing. You're not required to do any custom work to get this to work effectively. So that certainly is a good and easy route. And whenever you add a turbo to the engine, whether it's a manufacturer's own upgrade or it's an aftermarket upgrade, you do need to adjust the computer. The timing map, the fuel tables, everything inside that computer needs adjusting to take into account the much greater rate of flow going into the engine from this new turbo unit. So for the more advanced turbo upgrades, we start to look at larger turbos. And these usually require completely different pipe work to connect to your engine. So they require a little bit of specialist knowledge. You may need to get custom exhausts made up. It's very, very complex to start doing that. So I would really recommend that for most people watching this video, you look for a turbo kit that is compatible with your vehicle. It seems to become a little bit of a bodge when you start adding pipes to the exhaust to allow the turbo to mount, and you've just got to make sure that you've got a decent flow route from the turbocharger to the intake of the engine as well. If that's too long or too complex, you'll be adding unnecessary drag and restriction in the intake, which you really want to avoid in your project. So it really does pay if you can get all of the components from one place, a one-stop shop if you like, that can do the turbo installation and also sort out the computer tune for you. Because then if something goes wrong, you've just got one place to go back to diagnose the problems and sort it out. At the end of the day, it's usually the poor guy doing the computer tune that takes all of the flack, because he's generally the last step in the sequence. But he can help you understand what's going on in the engine. He can diagnose those problems that you're getting and just help you to get to the bottom of it. So the other situation you're in is if you've bought your turbo and the ancillary components from two different companies, and then you take it to someone to get the mapping and the computer tune sorted and spot on. And then if something goes wrong, who do you go back to? You generally have a lot of toing and froing between each of the stages or each of the companies that have offered services along the line. And it can be very hard to get to the bottom of problems. And also these one-stop shops, they generally do this procedure on your model of engine many times, so they understand the problems that crop up and they've ironed them out. They've sorted out all those little kinks and problems. If you're trailblazing a new setup yourself, that's where you start running into these first time issues that people have not really brought to your attention, and you start to have a bit of a headache in diagnosing those problems and faults. So just to summarize then, if you can get a turbo from the same manufacturer that literally just bolts on, that's probably one of the easiest upgrade options and the cheapest upgrade options you can. Many breakers yards and car dismantlers will have these parts readily available for you. If you get some kind of hybrid turbo which uses the stock turbo casing and all the insides have been machined out and the components within the turbo have been upgraded to give you different spool characteristics, again, that's a relatively simple upgrade in terms of the plumbing on the turbo. Then if you want those higher power figures, you can go for a completely custom larger turbo that will require completely different pipework to make it work properly on your engine. So that would generally require a new exhaust manifold, a different length of induction going from the air filter housing through the turbo into the engine intake itself. Adding a turbo is certainly one of the best power upgrades you can get, but it is a bit of a minefield. There's lots of forums out there, like the one we've got on our site, talkcars.com, but many other manufacturer specific forums are the place to go to discuss specific turbo upgrades for your engine. You can't beat that wealth of knowledge and experience out there. It's really best to learn from other people's mistakes than to make your own. So I hope this video has just been useful to you. It's answered that question and maybe just help you to work out that there is an easy upgrade path if you want a larger turbo to make those higher power figures, but there's also a much more complex route to go if you want those headline power figures that are really going to give you bragging rights down the pub. So please boot that like button, because that really does help us to get out there. Let us know in the comments what you've got planned for your car. We love hearing about people's projects and also the car make and model that you've got, so that I can tailor future videos to suit your own specific needs and requirements. So thank you so much for watching. I've lined this video up for you that you should find interesting to help you to get your project to those new power levels that you seek. I'll see you in the next video.